morning, everybody. Glad everybody could make it out at 8:30 this morning to hear this great panel. And Dr. Wright mentioned this is about public-private partnerships, but it's really about public innovation and public innovators, particularly around this topic of inclusive economic development. And so what I wanted to do very briefly before I invited them up, for some reason I woke up at 4:30 this morning and it wasn't playing, but I woke up, I couldn't go back to sleep, so I was like, well, let me do something. And so you know, I asked the panelists kind of what keeps them up at night. And so, you know, I guess this was keeping me up last night as I started thinking about kind of how to transition and kick off. And so what I want to do real quickly is just kind of put some context into kind of this conversation this morning, kind of how it fits into yesterday and going into tomorrow. Show you some context data, and then invite the panelists up, and we'll have, I think, a rich conversation about this whole idea of inclusive economic development. So a theme yesterday, for those who were here yesterday, we had a lot of we talked about a lot of data, right, as it relates to race and gender and entrepreneurship, and really we looked at a lot of things from I'd say a bird's eye view, a 30,000 foot level view. Today, I think we want to kind of dig in and say, you know, what do things look like on the ground, right? You know, we go from the theoretical to what is happening really in moving things forward. And so this panel kicks it off, and I was telling the panelists, I think, you know, this is certainly one of the most important topics around this, I think, because this is really where the rubber meets the road. And so I think it's important to talk about what's going on the ground in different communities. It also, I call, yesterday was kind of a full circle day. So the first panel yesterday talked a bit about the context of entrepreneurship, minority entrepreneurship, and it grounded it a bit. Dr. Clinton Boyd talked about the history of Haiti. And here in Durham is kind of an anchor. And then last night we ended the evening at a beautiful evening dinner where we debuted the exhibit on Black Wall Street. And so we kind of went full circle from that standpoint. I think, you know, I think we're going to do a bit of that again today from a standpoint of thinking about full circle. So we're going to talk this morning about the municipal level, these public innovators, and we're going to end the night watching a documentary about Maynard Jackson, who was Atlanta's first African-American mayor. He got elected at age 35. He's also, he's a graduate of North Carolina Central University Law School. I teach primarily at North Carolina Central University School of Business, so he has a tie. So we're gonna kind of go full circle, I think, as it relates to that. And the film, I've seen the film, I saw the film last year, and it's a wonderful film about how Maynard Jackson really pushed forward this idea of using the public sector to address some of these inequalities that he saw. Particularly, and we're talking now, he got elected in the 70s, so primarily it was black and white. Certainly we've expanded beyond that now, but he's kind of laid the groundwork, and there's also a lot of cost that he paid for that, you know, in terms of being out front, in terms of pushing this agenda of equity. And so I talked to our leaders today about some of those kind of similar things. But before we go into the panel, I want to kind of do a little bit of context and give you some data. There's a couple of points I want to share with you. You know, I come to this work, I guess, as an academic, but through the practitioner standpoint. I was a banker for years and worked in government. And it's very important to think about equity as it relates to inclusive development through the lens of these different sectors that actually work together. The public sector, the private sector, the philanthropic sector, they all have a role in this work. And so again, we had yesterday, JP Chase talked a bit about the initiatives that they had going on with Advancing Black Pathways, which had a combination of both JP Chase as the private entity as well as the philanthropic arm. The private sector conversation, they should fit kind of nicely into that. So a couple things. I do a lot of research around or the center part of my research is around inclusive and equity aspects, and a lot of it looks through the lens of local governments and cities and things of that nature. And so I want to give you kind of a few highlights of things around that. So, you know, if you think about the 60s and the civil rights movement, there was a lot of a huge role that the federal government had in really driving things at the local level. A lot of local level is where the problem was happening, and you had to kind of work your way up to get to the federal level to have some coverage in terms of addressing issues of race and historically gender, things of that nature. in the 21st century, contemporary times, 2019 is probably flipping, whereby a lot of the real work is happening at the local level. I don't know what's happening at the federal level these days, but it's not a whole lot in terms of moving things forward. So really the work at the local level is where it's happening, is where people get a chance to kind of share their voice and things of that nature. I've done this work of going into communities and understanding the equity of that, particularly through the lens of entrepreneurship, right? Who owns businesses? What kind of businesses they own? Do they have businesses with employees or without employees? Who gets the revenue? How much revenue do these different entrepreneurs get through the lens of both race and gender? But every community, we go through these ebbs and flows of diversity and inclusion and it being important and being on the forefront, kind of at a macro level. So every community I would go to was like, yeah, we're number one. We're doing all this stuff for inclusive development. We're including all these minority entrepreneurs. But a lot of times I would get some minority entrepreneur would pull me in the corner and say, look, man, they got me up here talking when they ain't giving me any money. And so what's happening on the ground is really what's important. So I actually created an index that allows you to look at a snapshot of what does equity look like in a community through the lens of entrepreneurial inclusivity and things of that nature. So I'm gonna show you a few of those graphs, but just some quick data points. What I have found is that, interesting enough, or maybe not interesting enough, it tends to, on average, when you look at different communities that are more politically liberal tend to be actually more economically inequitable. Which is very interesting. But some of that driver tends to be the fact that a lot of times, I guess if you want to sum it up, whites get capital, people of color get programs. And that ends up kind of creating wedges. So in a lot of times, the investment that the public sector makes, when you look at the budgets that they pass, they actually end up, it's not only that the communities are inequitable, but the public sector actually helps to drive the inequity, because when you invest, what I tend to see around white investment is that it's what I call wealth enhancing investment. So, let's help you build a hotel or something, and we throw some incentives in there and move that forth. When it comes to people of color, minorities, it tends to be more around this idea of programs that continue to kind of tether you to the social services, right? So we create a community center for you, and I guess, you can sit around and talk about your problems and things like that, but it doesn't end up kind of driving forth. So I want to give that context, and I want to show you a couple of kind of data points. So I actually do a talk that I call it In Search of Wakanda when I do it kind of broadly speaking, right? Particularly right after the Black Panther. And partly because when I talk to my students, I ask them this question: Black Panther was such a huge success, and people loved it, of kind of all races, genders, things of that nature. But my question was, well, is the only place that particularly in this case, African Americans or Black folks can have prosperity is on the screen in Wakanda, or are they places, actually in the real world that it happens, right? I tie that to In Search for Haiti. If you were around yesterday, Haiti is the Durham's historically Black area that was very prosperous at the end of the 19th century going to the 20th century. And so I kind of do this intermingly because Haiti, in a lot of ways, when you look at the data points, Haiti may be the closest thing that America's ever had to a Wakanda. And so I want to show you a couple of things quickly from that standpoint. So this is the index I created. So I wanted to show this as kind of an example. That flat line you see there is equity. So we had the question yesterday. The question was, well, what is our goal? Where are we trying to get to? And Dr. Darity mentioned, we're trying to get to equity. Equity in this sense means, what is your share of the overall population? And then do you get that same amount of share when it comes to economics? And again, this is through the lens of entrepreneurship. So equity basically would be the flat line, the green line. What that would mean would be that every population, these different racial populations, would be getting their share of the population from a population standpoint, that same kind of economic kind of feedback. But you see the different graphs of what it actually looks like. So I did this before because I have to do a lot of work here in Durham. The U.S., the yellow line, you see whites are up above equity, blacks are below equity, American Indians are slightly below, Asian Americans tend to be slightly above, Hispanics are below. On an American standpoint, Hispanics are actually lower than African Americans. North Carolina, is a bit more inequitable than Then the U.S. and then Durham is actually quite a bit inequitable. Whites are pretty far up, blacks are down. American Indians across the board tend to be on parity. Asians a little bit higher. Hispanics are right around the U.S. average. What that looks like from an economic strength standpoint, and I'm gonna go through these very quickly so we can start the panel, but I'm certainly open to talking. This is what we call I call equity gaps, right? This is when you look at between the different populations using the white community who has the strongest economic strength compared to different racial populations. The one on the left is the equity gap on U.S., the one in the middle, North Carolina, the one on the end is Durham. If you look at the scores at the top, imagine that, to put this in context, imagine these are dollars, right? And so what you would say would be that on average in America, whites have about $92 in their pocket, North Carolina about 112, in Durham 196, and blacks owe about $50 US, owe $76, North Carolina owe 143 in Durham, and you see the different scores. And so this is a way, and the way this is calculated, it looks at the share of the population that a community has of a particular race, the share of the business ownership, it breaks that down between businesses with employees and without employees, the share of the actual revenue that comes to those businesses, and then the share of the poverty that community has, because we know that people, when they, whether you're a woman, whether you're a person of color, whatever, whenever you start a business and you grow, you hire people from your network, and so technically there should be some kind of relationship between business growth and kind of poverty reduction and things of that nature. I want to quickly show, this is Durham versus Atlanta. So I put this up here because we talked yesterday about Tulsa and the Tulsa race riots, right? So there's a Tulsa race riot in 1921 that basically destroyed the black community of Greenwood. If you don't know about it, you should do research. I mean, they were like dropping bombs. I mean, it was a terrible kind of massacre in that case. When Tulsa was destroyed in 1921, Durham became essentially the de facto capital of black middle class, and the Black Wall Street. It was what was left after Tulsa went down, and Durham remained that way from essentially 1921 until the Durham Freeway, the highway system was put in, and some of the effects of that we know across the country. These highway systems were put through communities, user communities, black communities at that time that destroyed a lot of economic wealth. And so when Durham kind of dropped off, then right after that, Atlanta kind of became this hub, and Atlanta to this day still is kind of where, the black community says, oh, well, I'm gonna go to Atlanta and find my promise and my dreams and ambitions. But even Atlanta, as you see, which is a gray line, when you look on averages, the whites still are significantly above the equity point, blacks significantly low, and then the other populations remain kind of similar. And so you see that there are equity gaps. And I wanted to compare Durham and Atlanta to the United States, again, because those are the last two kind of black Wall Streets. And so it just shows you that even in places that have minority leadership, educated blacks, some level of wealth, there's still huge gaps. And again, this will come full circle because we will end the evening talking about Atlanta and what Mayor Jackson did. So finally, I have an appointment at Harvard University where I lead this effort with my colleague LaShawn Banks on looking across the country at cities and understanding where those cities fall from an equity standpoint, right? So what are the cities that are most equitable? This is actually brand new data. I actually just compiled it. We did a few, I guess about a month ago, we did a session in Harvard around, we had 21 cities come in from around the country as part of our project of municipal innovation. And so this is a comparison of those cities. So this is not a whole overall U.S. This is just a comparison of the cities that came into the equation. So this is the economic strength, which was at what I was saying about what's in your pocket. You see, at every city, whites are way up that green line at the top. Blacks who are in the red line tend to be at the bottom, along with Hispanics. So blacks and Hispanics kind of fight it out for the bottom in pretty much every community. Asians tend to be slightly above, everybody else, or above everybody else except whites, and then American Indians tend to be right at parity. And so this is kind of how the strength looks. The second graph, this is a bit more messy. This is that equity gap. or the economic equity gap. And this shows basically the same thing, that the white, the black gap, which is the green line, and the Hispanic gap, which is the purple line, have the highest gaps of all the populations. And the white to Asian gap, blue is the closest. And so it just gives you some kind of sense of what that looks like. And the last two information I want, what this looks at is of those cities, Newark had the biggest equity gap of everybody, and then it kind of goes down, where San Francisco had the lowest kind of equity gap amongst the different populations. And so you see it kind of across the board. And again, I know I'm kind of flying through this, but I'm happy to share the data with you going forward. And the last slide I have, I looked at 10 factors and ranked them from an economic standpoint and said, okay, well, so from an equity standpoint, of the 21 cities that came together, who's the most and who's the less equitable? I ranked those, and so the lowest score anybody could get would be a 10. That would mean that they would rank first in being the most equitable in all these different categories. The worst score to get is a 210, meaning they would rank 21st in all of these 10 categories. And so you see San Francisco actually ended up with the best ranking when you looked at across the racial standpoint in terms of the having the most equitable outcomes amongst the different racial populations. Providence, Rhode Island, tiny little Providence ended up coming in 21st. Newark, who has a very large African-American population, ended up at 20th, but this is kind of the ranking. So I want to give you some context as we move into this conversation today and this morning about, what does this look like on the ground? And we're going to talk to some great leaders from these different cities as we grapple with what is the role of the public sector in addressing these economic inequities. And so let me ask the panelists to please take your place on stage. Thank you. So this is an all-star panel we got here. And I thank everybody for coming out. I was trying to figure out, who do I ask the first question to and how do I move forward? So I thought about, try to be good hospitable. I thought about ladies first. It was one option, right? Then Steve, I thought about age before beauty. I was trying to figure that one out. Thank you. And then I said, well, maybe I try to do the Southern hospitality thing and from the distance by which folks travel, right? So Mayor Kawakami, who represents Kauai and Island, Hawaii, came from the farthest I know. You're 6 hours behind us, so I think it's about 3 o'clock in the morning, kind of where you are. And Mike Jasso came from Sacramento, so 6 hours, 3 hours behind. Loren and Steve are both on the East Coast, but Loren came from New York, so we're going to go to her and then Steve. So what I wanted to really just start out with something for each of you to just kind of briefly give us a sense of, I'll start with you, Mayor. Why did you want to be the mayor why, the kind of questions basically, why did you want the role that you're in now? Why did you decide you want to be the mayor of Kauai and does it have any tie into this inclusive conversation?
Sure, thank you, Dr. McKoy. First and foremost, I want to thank all the organizers of this wonderful event. Dr. McKoy, thank you for getting me out here. I have a couple friends from Kauai that are joining me. I have my managing director, Mike DeHillig, and I have Mayor Rose Munar, so thank you folks for being here. I wanted to be mayor because I was young and foolish. Actually, I was, to break it down real simple and to save time, I was unhappy with the current system. You see, I come from the private sector, the grocery business, so I grew up in retail, and what I was not seeing happen were those tough, unpopular decisions that are the right decisions to make. And so I felt that Kauai County was a bit stuck in the mud as far as being innovative, as far as fighting for inclusivity, and as far as moving our island forward to be able to adapt to the changing world. And so with that being said, it really drew me in. I got involved like most people, volunteering on a campaign, ran for county council, got on the county council, moved up to the State House of Representatives, and And ultimately, I wanted to move into that CEO position to be able to enact change. That's what it was.
Fantastic. So thank you. So Mike, you've been in D.C. As far as Mayor Williams' cabinet there. You were in Chicago, where your background's in Chicago. Now you went from you're East Coast, kind of Midwest. Now you're way on the West Coast in Sacramento. Why do you want to be assistant city manager of Sacramento?
Sure. For me, it was a personal endeavor as well as a kind of professional endeavor. So one, I was itching for a new challenge, new experience. I had been in Chicago 11 years. Chicago's home for me. It'll always be home. I love the city. And Sacramento was looking for an assistant city manager, and there was a lot of appeal as I went through the process. So Sacramento is, the capital of California, so it's the capital of the most economically significant state in the union, population of 40 million. Sacramento is growing. It's the fastest growing city in California, about 500,000 people. And it's also arguably the most diverse city in the United States, at least when you look on paper, which is really appealing. One of the things you find is sometimes you need to go beyond the paper, because while if you look at Sacramento and you see its diversity in terms of ethnic breakout and racial breakup of the city and where the city is going, it's very attractive, and the city's aware of that. But one of the things you'll find is, in fact, that same diversity is by no means represented in leadership if you look across industry and institutions. So just because it's diverse doesn't mean it's inclusive, is an important reminder. And being in California, there's always a self-awareness of being a liberal place, and I think to some degree discounts some of those important distinctions that happen there. But it's a city that's on the move. It's growing very fast. We were just awarded an MLS team on Thursday, so go Sac Republic. And a lot of changes are happening there in the city. That being said, it's a hugely challenged city. We have a high degree of growing skills gap. We're increasingly becoming a minority city, and all the pressures that being part of the Great Bay economy both accrue to Sacramento's benefits, but also its challenges. So it's a fascinating place. There's leadership. And then I think a last front for people in the public sector like me, one of the things that was of interest was the fact that I'd be going from, I've always worked in a situation with a strong chief executive. And here I was moving to a situation with a strong city manager, which is a very important distinction in what that means. So it's an interesting challenge for me, understanding that balance and how do you push a broad, inclusive, and equitable economic agenda in that structure.
Fantastic. Thanks for that. So Loren, so you got this international international guru background, right? So you World Bank, United Nations, this international flair on the International Finance Corporation. But you decided now that you want to be in this role, this domestic role in New York City. So what led you to going from this even though obviously we know New York is a global center, but what attracted you to that position is leading economic development?
Sure. So I think New York, the opportunity kind of came across it when it came into New York, and I think it really offered the best of both worlds, the international and the domestic aspects. So I'm leading the economic development work at the New York City Mayor's Office for International Affairs. Mm-hmm. So that really brought in a lot of the international aspect and the domestic aspect. And New York, yes, exactly as you said, its GDP is $1.8 trillion. It's larger than all but 11 countries in the world. It has sectors in everything that you could think of, from finance, food, fashion, et cetera, and the second largest tech ecosystem next to Silicon Valley. It was just really an opportunity to be able to jump in there and really work in that space. We have the largest international affairs aspect in New York City. We have the largest diplomatic corps in the world. So our office works with 116 consulates or embassies, 193 permanent missions to the UN and the UN. as well as 70 plus trade missions. So we have a constant flow of international businesses coming into New York City. So I was super excited about that aspect of, so I'm tasked with one, bringing in international businesses into New York City, getting them connected to the various opportunities, business incentives, resources that the city provides. And then also, because indeed it's so big that it's actually tough when you get in there and start a business, where things are and how to even start a business, what are the regulatory framework. But then second is also being able to work with the local businesses, so especially minority-owned, immigrant-owned, and women-owned entrepreneurs, which as an immigrant and having worked at a startup myself as well, so that was very close to my heart. So being able to work with that community and helping them connected globally and expand globally should they want to access new markets, new partners, et cetera. I can then leverage, the country connections that we've got and have them literally pick up the phone and say, hey, we've got an entrepreneur in Brooklyn that wants to expand into South Africa or looking for partners and new markets there. Could you help this New York City business expand into your market and navigate it on that side? And then thirdly, on being able to also work on policies and programs and develop that aspect that represents this international business, international community that we work with. So for example, and very specifically is, what's happening on the federal government, it's harder for entrepreneurs to come in. We find that as a very big challenge because for us, in New York, which is super exciting, is that the majority of businesses, 50% or more, are immigrant-owned businesses, right? And then small businesses, as an overall, are the largest private sector employers of the city, right? So if we are having this challenge of a less amount of innovation and creativity and business and ingenuity, that's a challenge that we're anticipating down the road could be a challenge. So then being able to, get our minds together and say, hey, what are kind of out-of-the-box solutions that we can think of to continue to bring that innovation and that openness, continue that openness that we've always had as a city, and able to also look at some of the international counterparts that we've got. For example, Estonia has the e-residency program, which allows entrepreneurs to literally operate in Estonia virtually, as well as the whole EU market. And so what are other ways that we could pick from those international best practices that would fit the New York economy?
Good. Great kind of context on that. And so, first of all, let's all thank Mayor Schewel for being the host mayor here, and we appreciate your hospitality and rolling out the red carpet for our different guests that's coming from all around. So Steve, you are a longtime public servant, but you also have a business background. You ran the Independent Weekly. You started, founded, and ran it. So you've been in this public space a very long time. This is your first term as mayor. Why did you decide that you wanted to run?
I was kind of the opposite of the mayor. He was young and foolish. I was old and foolish. But I think foolish is the operant word there. This is a wonderful city, and I want to first, as Henry said, welcome you all. It's great to have everybody here, and we hope you really enjoy yourself.
And he's the reason why we're here at 8:30. No, he's got to do some city work later on today. Right. With a work session. So blame him if you didn't want to be here at 8:30.
Thank you for accommodating me.
Yes.
So we have a wonderful city, and I've been fortunate enough to raise my kids here, and it is a city that is, if you go downtown, you'll see the cranes in the air. We are enjoying a newfound prosperity. And that prosperity is wonderful for most of us, for 80% of us, but for 20% of our residents or thereabouts, predominantly people of color, they are not able to share in our newfound prosperity. And that's really the challenge that we face. And I think that the graphs that Henry put up really show that in very, very stark relief. In a lot of ways, we're living on our laurels here in Durham. We have a very proud history. Again, as Henry mentioned, I know you all have heard about this already at the conference, of African-American entrepreneurship and business leadership. And in a lot of ways, we're resting on the laurels of that history. We are not living up to that history, and that is a critical challenge for our community and one that we have to meet. So we have a very, very diverse city, and we have a very diverse in-migration. So the Washington Post recently did an article, kind of an infographic type of article, and they looked at, I believe, 150 cities, and they looked at the diversity of their in-migration. And we are in the top 10 in in-migration per capita amongst whites, African Americans, and Asian Americans, and pretty high in Hispanic Americans as well. So we're a city that's diverse and attracting a very diverse in-migration, but we have the same problem that you talked about, that our diversity has not led to the economic inclusion that we know is so critically important. And that's a really important distinction that we all try to keep in mind. Yes, we want to embrace everyone. We want to make sure that everyone that moves to Durham, regardless of their race, their documentation status, whatever it is, that they're welcome here. But we also want to have the economic inclusion and the equity that we know we don't have. And so I feel like my job as mayor is to try to change that. That's why I want to be mayor. I don't want to be mayor so I can sit up there and like go through the rezoning hearings. They're not the reason. The reason is, can we try to create a more just community? Can we make the city we love a city for all? I think that's really the question.
So that gives a great kind of framework and context for everybody is here. I want to actually pick up on the theme that's come across here, and I want to ask you, Mayor, an interesting part about that. So Mike argued about Sacramento being, on paper, one of the most diverse cities in the country from a kind of a diversity standpoint. I know Loren may have a couple of things to say about that with New York, but you have the huge immigrant kind of mix in New York, and anybody that's been in New York, kind of the vibrancy, excitement, Mayor, in-migration, diversity, all these kind of things are going on. So Derek, your community is unique, right? In the sense, it's diverse, but in a different way, right? So can you tell us, for those who I guess don't know a whole lot about, Kauai and Hawaii, kind of when you talk about diversity and when you think about it from an inclusionary standpoint, it's not necessarily the typical, I say, stark lines between blacks and whites and Latinos, and what is it how do you think about diversity and inclusion based on your demographics?
Well, Kauai is unique in the sense that it is truly the melting pot of America, we believe. We have every ethnicity under the sun, and a large part of that was born out of the sugar industry. We had laborers that immigrated to Hawaii to work in the sugar plantation fields and the pineapple fields. But inclusivity remains a challenge. We have a growing gap of the have and the have-nots. We have a population shift where we're starting to see more people of wealth falling in love with paradise and deciding to call Kauai home. And even though we're a visitor industry-based, service-based economy, and most of our people are working in that sector, there seems to be a growing stress point when you talk about the increase in traffic, the lack of affordable housing. And so things haven't gotten better over the time. So where we're seeing this gap is between those that have been struggling, working 2 or 3 jobs, versus those that are very wealthy. And if we don't close that gap, things are not going to change for the better. And so our challenge as far as inclusivity is finding ways that we can bring some of those folks that are struggling, empower them, and empower entire communities in that sense, and get them included and involved, and bring up and close that gap. So that in and of itself remains to be a unique challenge to Hawaii. You don't really see the racial divides. It's more of an economic divide that we're seeing. And things have not moved as quickly as we wanted it to. And so there is this growing distrust between the private sector and government. So it makes it extremely challenging to get out to those communities and have them buy into those plans of actions that we have moving forward.
So Steve, Durham knows a bit about issues of trust, right? between kind of the communities and the leadership, things of that nature. So Durham adopted, I say a year or so ago, a shared economic prosperity kind of part of the 5-year plan, right? And I have a racial equity task force, some appointed things of that nature. As you sit in this role today, what is your hardest or biggest challenge in your mind of getting to that point of this economic inclusion you say you would like to see from the population? What stands in your way?
Nothing but the political will to do it. I think that we have a plan. It's a plan that you helped us develop, and so I hope it's a good one. If not, you know who gets the blame. It's not you, it's going to be me. But yeah, we have a plan, and our plan consists of a couple of different things, one of which is that we think that, well, let me just step back. If you go downtown in Durham, as I say, you see cranes in the air, you see the development that we have, and part of this development has been created by an advocacy organization called Downtown Durham Incorporated, which the city has funded maybe $250,000 a year for the past, decade or more than that. And this has helped to facilitate the development of downtown Durham. It's been an advocate for the businesses there. It's helped people work with city government to arrange incentives. It's been a really important advocate and connector for downtown businesses. And now we have in this year's budget, and I just want to say hello to our budget director, Bertha Johnson, who's here. We have in our this year's budget $300,000 to create that same sort of advocacy organization for minority and women-owned businesses throughout our city, because we think that they need that same kind of advocacy that has helped us make the kind of downtown that we've made. Full props to Henry. This was something that he's been advocating for. When I was first elected 2 years ago, he sat down and talked to me about this, and I'm really happy we have it in our budget. We also know, though, that, and so this will help connect businesses to capital. It will help connect them to opportunities. It will advocate for them. And it will also help them connect them to training in finance and marketing and accounting. But we also know that that's not enough, and that what businesses also need is access to capital. And so that is the second step in our plan. And once we get this organization up and rolling, which should be this year, then we have to take the second step, which is to try to give people access to capital, both debt and equity. And we will be working on how to create a fund to do that. I don't pretend that we're ahead of the game on this. We're not. We're behind. I know that there are other cities that do it better than us. And one of the things that we've done is we've looked at some of those cities to see who is doing it well. There are already cities that have these funds, and they're working. And so that's what we'd like to create in Durham, is that kind of opportunity. What stands in the way, I think, is just the will to do it. I'm not saying it'll be easy, even if we have the will. But I know that we can. If we put our shoulders to the wheel, we can raise the debt and equity fund that will help these businesses get off the ground and prosper. And so I think that's our job.
So speaking of debt and equity, I want you to address briefly a two-part kind of tie into that, right? So one is this question around the government as a driver of this work, and whether, as you in Sacramento have seen challenges around, what is the infrastructure, right? Inclusion and diversity is something that everybody talks about, but it's not something that's been ingrained in governments per se. And so, just as Steve's saying it doesn't necessarily mean that it just happens, right? You have to create an infrastructure. So what is the kind of the status of Sacramento around that? The second part that I want you to just touch on is that Steve mentioned debt and equity in the investment. You all have been very bold in terms of your mayor, Darrell Steinberg, in terms of this idea of investment, right? And so I got engaged originally because you all have passed a half-cent sales tax for something called Measure U. This is Sacramento. It's the state capital. That half-cent sales tax generates something like $40 million a year, things like that. And there was a desire to create a large investment pool. So can you talk again a bit about what your infrastructure looks like, and then also kind of tell folks kind of where you are with this investment pool that you all are pulling together?
Sure. So, so with respect to government, it's interesting in Sacramento and coming from a different place. So in Sacramento, I would say that there's a strong distrust of institutions, government being foremost among them. At the same time, there is a desire, kind of broadly written, that government should lead. So that creates a certain challenge in and of itself, because we're not trusted to be that leader, yet we're being demanded on to be that leader. So one of the things, now we have a mayor who has a great voice in terms of leadership, in terms of what we're doing. But I will tell you, Sacramento as a city is institutionally poor. And by that, I mean in the sense of, because we've historically been a government city, it means that we don't have a lot of the community-based organization capacity, the corporate capacity, et cetera, that a lot of other cities. So one of my first observances coming to Sacramento is that we have fewer of the institutions that I would expect to be partners than other cities of our similar size might have. So one of our challenges is just building up institutions. Secondly, within the government itself, Sacramento was among the hardest hit in the recession, 2009, 2008. So we lost a tremendous amount of internal capacity. Simultaneously, we lost some capacity that existed. I think probably everyone here is coming from a state that has tax increment finance. So the state that pioneered kind of tax increment finance redevelopment was the first state to get rid of it. California does not have redevelopment anymore. And all the institutions that surrounded that kind of went away at that time as well. So that's one of the challenges we have. I often say that as government, we can only be as good as our public and private partners out there in doing this. So we're building that. So internally, one of the things we are doing with the adoption of Measure U, and I'll talk a little bit more in detail, is just building up city capacity. Literally our ability to engage our communities, help them figure out the institutions that need to be in place, work with our property improvement districts that exist. We have 11 of them throughout the city, and other organizations, philanthropic and otherwise. That's a big challenge we have right now. In last year, in 2018, Sacramento took to the ballot a measure called Measure U. For those of you unfamiliar with California, any tax ballot measure has to go to the ballot. And depending on the nature of that, if it's a general tax, you need to have 50 plus 1%. And if it's a specialized tax that simply says it's absolutely dedicated to this function, you need to have a 2/3 vote with respect to it. We did Measure U, the mayor did Measure U as a general tax, very much focused on it being for economic development. But technically it's not. Technically, it's a general use tax. And so one of the challenges we have now internally in the city is, as we see budgets beginning to tighten for police, fire, pensions, everything else that everyone's grappling with, how much of that will go towards directed economic development, particularly in our disaffected most communities as we move forward. That having been said, we are moving forward with a lot of things. We have identified dedicated funding for issuing a housing bond that we expect to move forward with. We're putting a lot of the institution in place as we move forward, including things like just how do we have public engagement. At the beginning of 2018, we underwent a process called Project Prosper, where it was mainly a public engagement strategy of let's understand at the ground level what communities are striving for, what are their issues, challenges, where can we fill the gap and foster other institutions to carry the work moving forward. We're very much in that process. So one of the greatest challenges we have is the issue of let's be thoughtful, mindful. I'm appreciative of the mayor's importance of a plan. We are currently working on an economic development plan that talks about how do we grow our economy, and in growing that economy, ensure that equity is baked in at all levels, not that we have a plan for growing the economy here and a plan for addressing equity here. It needs to be fundamental to our process. So this challenge we have is being deliberate and thoughtful, but we have a hunger as a city to move expeditiously. So.
Yeah, and so if I know the number right, so the mayor originally in Sacramento wanted this kind of $400 million investment and wanted to do it in a way that that would be bonded in a way that basically says, well, even if I'm not mayor or Mike's not assistant city manager, the city's still on the hook essentially to make these kind of investments from that standpoint. So it was very bold. I think you all settled on $250 million kind of as a bonding or focus capacity, and so you're working through some of those things. And so we went from kind of some of the initial work here in Durham, this $300,000 for this work, to stand this organization and going forward with fund. This $250 million kind of commitment in Sacramento, and I know the mayor, when he talked to me, he was talking about investing in historically underutilized communities, and the African American corridor. Even though African Americans don't make up they're not the biggest minority, but really trying to address some past issues. So we talked about hundreds of thousands, hundreds of millions. Let's talk to the billion lady, right? So New York is big, right? And you talked a little bit about just a little bit, right? $1.8 trillion in overall. You talked a little bit about, all your different constituents, right? So you got immigrant populations, you have diverse populations, you have the women's side, you have the racial side. Can you talk a little bit quickly about some of the work that you're doing, right? I know there's a women around tech. New York is the top financial market in the world. It's like number 2 for tech, right?
Yep.
So around women, you also, I think there's some procurement work that you're doing. And so can you talk quickly about those things that you all are working on?
Yeah, no, thanks, Henry. So yes, exactly. I'll touch on one is the We Venture Fund. So indeed, we've got the second largest tech ecosystem. However, only 2% of venture capitals go to women, and even less to Latinx or Black women entrepreneurs. And so the city has invested $10 million. So the We Venture Fund is specifically targeted at injecting finance for women, and particularly women of color in tech, to access that opportunity. So the city has invested and catalyzed a fund for that. So $10 million the city has put in, but then also leverage and convene 5 other venture capitals to put in double that money, $20 million, so a total of $30 million specifically for women and women of color in tech to be able to access that funding. Because we really see that as a challenge, we see how I lived in the Bay Area, and so previously in a previous life, so that I was really shocked that San Francisco was number 1. I was like, really? Just on the tech space, we really see that the more that there's innovation and creativity from all communities, the better that sector is going to be. Right, so it's very, very economic-driven, very business-driven perspective. And then the second one I'd like to share that you alluded to is the Minority Women Business Owned Enterprise programs, our MWBE program that the city does. So the city spends about $17 billion a year on goods and services. So we want to we have a target of having minority women-owned businesses in New York City to be able to tap into those procurement opportunities. So the goal right now is for 30% of the overall value of the city services to go to MWBEs. And we've just recently hit our target of 9,000 being city certified by this year. And then just overall by 2025 to hit the $20 billion of those city contracts goes to minority women-owned business enterprises. Now, I share also a challenge in that is that getting certified is like, and having worked at a small business myself, you really have to think, is this worth my time? What's the process? Is this crazy loops that I have to... So that is our challenge, right? How can we better simplify that so that, business time is money? So how can we expedite it more? So what we're doing is we've got small business service centers all across the 5 boroughs. And literally, if you're interested, we will have, folks to sit down with you and go through that and even try to think through how can we further simplify this crazy process, right? So that we can actually really, not just on paper say, well, it's there, but what's the good of it if nobody's accessing it, right? So I think those are kind of the 2 things that we're doing. But I also want to add another one. And so I think our Black Entrepreneurship Initiative in New York City, which is really, really at the very start of it, is, New York City, more than 20% is African American population. However, only 2% own small businesses. So we see that really an opportunity to grow that, but also to really close the gap on the wealth creation aspect. You know, if you, for a household that has that owns a business versus someone working for someone, your net worth is 6 times more than someone that is, you know, being employed like me. And so we really want to start building the seeds for that, and that's very much in the early stages, and really tapping into the different chambers of commerce, like the Harlem Chamber of Commerce in Brooklyn, and also even, you know, kind of communities with the Caribbean community and also our Haitian communities. And we're in a very much in that space of listening in on really, you know, what's happening on the ground. And then the plan is that, you know, then take that along with some research and data, and then put in a proposal on what are effective ways we could do a program to really invigorate that space more. And in tandem, that was the approach that we had with our women's entrepreneurship program. So we NYC, it's very much the approach that we've done. It's one of our crown jewels, is that program. You know, New York City has been the number one for women entrepreneurs in the world as far as the environment for women, and that took a lot of, you know, kind of listening in and what really is happening, and really developing a program that really is suited to the community.
So you got a number of these initiatives that you're trying to go to these diverse populations simultaneously and kind of move them up, and so so Derek, I want to ask you, so Kauai is a unique kind of animal in the sense of Hawaii is a group of islands, right? And so it's this kind of county mayor thing. So you got these different communities that actually are on the island, and so unlike you know, well, I guess in some ways it could be like New York. I mean, you got boroughs, but you have these different communities, right? And these different communities have different capacities. One of the things that you're literally kind of in paradise in some ways, right? And so I mean, I was in Kauai, and Mike took me around and showed me some opportunity zones. It didn't like any opportunity zones I haven't seen anywhere, right? You know, the lap of luxury opportunity zone. But you all, you mentioned May Rose. You all have been working on a couple of different things on the island with the idea that, hey, all things aren't created on the island, right? And so, you know, in Waimea, you know, there's a couple things going on, and also you have kind of visions for how you all can move other projects forward. So can you talk a little bit about, particularly the county recently did a pretty significant land acquisition, 417 acres. Can you talk a little bit about the vision around that, as well as maybe some of the old sugar mills that are sitting there? In Durham, we have old tobacco warehouses and mills, and so you all have these sugar plantations.
Absolutely. And I'd like to point out also that the topic is public-private partnerships. So we do have somebody from the private sector, May Rose Munar. She's a Kauai born and raised, grew up on the plantation, struggled, worked hard, left Kauai, found some success and moved back, and has really donated her time and her talent, which is what we're looking for. We have this infamous brain drain on Kauai where, because there's a lack of opportunity, some of our best and brightest, they're moving away, they're getting educated, and they're finding out that there's nothing for them back home to come home to. So their hearts are bleeding to come back home, but they're staying away because they have their own families to raise. So when we do get to bring back some of our younger folks and they can contribute their talents, there's just so many good things that can come to our community. And part of that was May Rose had a vision for Kikaha sugar mill. I mean, sugar, when I say sugar, really built our culture from the foods that we eat, the way that we speak, the way that we walk and talk, just the little subtle differences on how we do things. It was built on sugar. And, you know, with the closing of the sugar industry, these old sugar mills who have acted like monuments in our towns are slowly disappearing. I can remember when they took down the smokestack from Lihue Sugar Mill, it was like losing the Eiffel Tower to us. You know, you're on an island where nothing can be built higher than the tallest coconut tree. I'm honest, folks, that was one of our laws, that the building couldn't be taller than the tallest coconut tree. And so when you start losing these points of reference, it's truly heartbreaking, not only to our community, but to those folks that helped build and lay down that foundation for all of us. So there was an effort from Mayrose and the Kikaha community to acquire that old Kikaha sugar mill, have it be a hub of economic development and innovation, and start to diversify our economy. The visitor industry is always going to be the base foundation, and that needs to be vibrant, but we're trying to diversify our economy to take away those real high peaks and lows that the visitor industry brings as well. And it's really a project to empower entire communities. So even that 417 acres of very productive agricultural land that we were able to acquire for $5.3 million, that might sound like a lot of money for 417 acres, but when you consider the land values on Kauai, it was a steal. And we were very fortunate to have a legacy family have the vision to say that we'd like to place this in the public trust to empower West Kauai, which is a community that historically has always felt like they were left behind. When you take a look at the average household income, when you take a look at the rate of people going off to college, it's lower than Kauai County's average. So the first thing that we plan on doing is going out there and just listening. You know, I spoke about my managing director. At the age of 29, he was the planning director of Kauai. He helped conduct our general plan, which won a national award as far as being the best general plan on the smallest island in the state of Hawaii. And he simply did that by realizing that government cannot just drive things without being met with resistance. So he took his planning department to each community, and he made sure that inclusivity was the primary focal point. So he reached out to millennials, knowing that they utilize social media. He realized that some of the older folks weren't going to come to community meetings, so they knocked on doors. They did walking meetings where they had the meeting conducted by walking entire blocks. And he really sent his department out there just to listen. And from those listening sessions, they were able to formulate that general plan. And as we continue to go out to the west side of Kauai, that's the same tack that we're going to take, realizing that not everybody wants to get up on a mic. In fact, most people on Kauai, because we have a culture that don't make waves, people will not get up on a mic. So what we do is we have these sessions where we have different stations, and depending on what piques your interest, everybody has an opportunity to be heard. And so really, those two projects are really designed to have West Kauai and the community come out to tell us what those needs are. We have a good idea just based on what they've been talking about, but they like to focus on sports and recreation as a part of economic development. We have the Pacific Missile Range facilities, so I know that science, technology, engineering, and math is going to be another component. But I'm very excited to be a part of that process, and we have to thank our partners in the private sector for being a willing partner, to having the trust in us. And moving forward, that's going to be the model that we're going to be doing things.
Thank you. Yes, and I note that in terms of these projects, whether it be the mill or the land, there's been this constant dialogue about finding ways that the people in the community can have like ownership in it, right, and get some benefit from that. So as we kind of move, and I certainly hope you all have a few questions for the panelists. I want to kind of ask just a couple more questions. Steve, what do you want to accomplish before you leave this role as mayor? What do you want your legacy to be, and does it have anything to do with this idea of inclusion?
Sure. Yes, absolutely. It has a lot to do with this idea of inclusion. One of the things that we're doing now, which I don't think it's so much in terms of legacy, but I think in terms of what are the important things that we got to get done. And like I say, I'm old. I'm not going to be mayor that long. I have another couple of years, though, at least. And What I'm looking forward to, first of all, we have a housing bond. We have a $95 million affordable housing bond on the ballot, which we really need to get passed here in Durham. It's not just a housing program, though. It's also an economic development program, and it can be a very, very important way in which we can increase economic inclusion for disadvantaged businesses. The bond is a $95 million affordable housing bond. It'll do a lot for housing, which I could talk about way longer than you want to hear me talk about it. Don't smile, Bertha. I know you've heard me talk about it way too long, for too many times. So has Henry. But on the economic development side, this $95 million, it's going to leverage another roughly $450 million of additional spending. So you're talking about a $500 million construction program, and we want to make sure that that's inclusive. This is an incredible opportunity, a large-scale opportunity for a small city to create a lot of economic inclusiveness. And so we have set a floor of $130 million. Of that amount will be for historically disadvantaged businesses. African American, Latinx, and women-owned businesses. And we know especially, we do a lot better with women-owned businesses in Durham than we do with African American-owned businesses. And we know that that's something that we really have to change. So this $130 million is, as I say, is the floor, and it is a real opportunity. We have, one of the ways in which we think we can do that is to get the right private partners, as the mayor said, and that includes the developers who will be part of this redevelopment, this housing redevelopment. So the first one for the first project that will go forward, should the bond be passed on November 5th, and so if you're from Durham, please vote for it. That is an African-American, a firm that's owned by an African-American woman, a developer out of Charlotte, who is very experienced at working with disadvantaged businesses as subcontractors. And so we're very ambitious about our target, and we feel very good about our ability to make it. We also, our Housing Authority Director has a lot of great experience in doing this as well. So we think that that can be a tremendous tool for economic inclusiveness. And when I think about what my goals are, that's definitely over the next couple of years. I mean, one of the things that I've spent my last couple of years trying to think about how to get this affordable housing thing going at scale. How do we intervene in the market against the forces that are driving gentrification and making our city less affordable and less diverse? And I think that our next goal needs to be, how do we work on the income side? If you're making enough money, there is an affordable house for you here in Durham right now. But the problem is, of course, that we don't have the incomes, especially in our communities of color, and we have to change that. And ownership and wealth building is a big part of that. So that's an important piece of work that I think that we all need to be doing in Durham in the next couple of years. And it's like all these big challenges, it's hard. I don't pretend that it's going to be easy. It's going to need everybody's ideas, and it's going to be expensive because all the hard things that we do are expensive, and we have to figure out how to make that happen.
So the idea with the affordable housing bond is that it has dual purposes, right? It houses, but it also creates economic opportunity. $130 million of possible procurement opportunities for minorities. Of course, a lot of the, I'm sure all you deal with is this question of how do you make that connection, right? How do you go from the vision of the opportunity to the actual connection of those things? Mike, I want to ask you, so you're still fairly new in your role. You still, I guess, maybe on your honeymoon or a little bit after so far with the city of Sacramento. You mentioned earlier the recovery from the recession, the previous recession. There's now some potential, dialogue around a upcoming recession at some point. In terms of your work, I got a kind of a quick couple of parts. So one is, who is the hardest population that you've seen since you've been there to reach, right, in terms of this inclusion work? I mean, are they particular folks that just seem like that it's very, very hard to get to them in terms of pulling them into that mix? And does the potential of another recession, does it concern you as to that this whole work around inclusion is going to get derailed, or do you feel like that you all will keep moving on this?
Well, I like to believe that you can't view working on inclusion only when times are good, right? Inclusion has to be fundamental to your economic prosperity plan, because the reality is if you're not viewing it as inclusive, you'll never reach an optimum prosperity plan. That's demonstrated all over, and it's something we have to be aware of. We're also hopeful that the institutions, infrastructure that we're putting in place should have always been in place. How do we support, so I'm a big, I jokingly say I'm an economic development person, historically I'm used to working on deals, programs, projects, but if someone asked me if you only could work on one thing that would truly transform your community, what would you do? And I say workforce development all day long. Because if you build the human capital asset in your community, that will be a tremendous competitive advantage for your community. And I don't know if any place is doing it particularly well, but I do know that those places that do it better will have a huge advantage. And that's especially going to be true in our state of California, just because the dynamics of cost on the coastal cities, et cetera, on it. With respect to, I was forgetting the first part of the question.
The most challenging population.
Yeah, I think the most challenging populations are definitely all our communities of color, but particularly the African American community. Partly because of distrust. In many ways, the movement towards trying to be deliberately more inclusive and equitable was driving in Sacramento as it was around the country. But like a lot of cities, we had a very unfortunate event happen a year and a half ago, which was the shooting of Stephon Clark, not unlike many other things. And the reality is that was just the one of many kinds of similar incidents that just happened to be the most visible to public. But that created a huge amount of tension and crisis in our community. But as all crises are also pathways to opportunity. So how we reach those communities in a meaningful way so that we build trust, we build legitimacy as government, right? So first way to build trust is actually be real about what we're doing and doing it in a meaningful way and engaging those communities moving forward. That's one of the biggest challenges, and then leaving the institutions and infrastructure that will survive an economic downturn. So we're trying to be very deliberate as we add resources within the city, both programmatic and otherwise, as to how are these sustainable over the long term. So, and this is the challenge that we have, though, as I said earlier, between this dichotomy of moving fast and big and moving deliberately over time. Those are the things we're grappling with, but you got to make progress and not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. Just advancing things forward as we can.
So. Great. Loren, you're still very new to your job as well. I mean, you're still working your way through and leading these different efforts. And so I told y'all earlier, I woke up at 4:30 for some reason and come back to sleep. And so I want to ask you, what keeps you up at night, right? What is it that jumps on your mind around this work that keeps you keeps your mind moving at night, and what do you hope to accomplish in the end?
Big and heavy question, and definitely something that I think of every day. So, I think for me, on a very, very basic level, is how do we ensure the opportunities are available? So, I think one of the things that keeps me up is like talent is universal, but opportunity is not. Why isn't it? And so that's what kind of keeps me up at night. I shared all the great things about New York City. Oh, okay, let me back it up a little bit, right? So I think that is very much on a personal level, just a very ingrained value for myself. So my family immigrated from the Philippines. My mom was a single mother. And then to a point that when I was here in high school, we're at a university, I didn't even know how to take the SATs. I think I was sharing with Henry, I didn't know how to take the SATs to go to college because my parents and my mother was really busy trying to just make sure to put roof over our heads, food on the table, and then you know what? You go and figure out what needs to be done and go with that. So I think that in and of itself, and then the pathways that my family has personally gone through, economically, and how that has, and I look back on what could have been, had I known certain opportunities, even like now, New York City's open, has all these opportunities to, free to how do you start your business, how do you work with top legal firms for free, and this is all paid by your taxes. Had I known that, had my mother had known that, I think we would be at a different place earlier or so. So I think that's why also for me it's a personal passion, and then also to be able to see a lot of the communities in New York City, because I see my family quite a lot in a lot of the communities across of the city. So I really want to ensure and that those opportunities are accessible to as many communities as possible. I mentioned that we have a large immigrant community, and also that's a challenge as well too. There's 200 languages spoken in New York City. A lot of our regulations, a lot of our opportunities are in English. Now we're starting to translate that and also provide those services across various languages. And also Manhattan is like where business gets done. The immigrant communities are in Queens and in Brooklyn quite a lot, right? So we're now getting out there more and providing those services in language, door to door, and also online. It's what are the different ways to get it to the hands of the people? I think of course I'm super biased on the New York City aspect, but I also come from very emerging market background, the chunk of my experience. And from that experience, for each of the countries that I've worked in, didn't have as much economic development, opportunities or incentives to be able to offer. What I see in New York City is that we do have amazing opportunities and economic development front to be able to offer to communities, but the challenge is it somehow is not getting there as deep as I would want it to be, as the city would love it to be. The great thing is that there's really great political will. There's really one of the things that the mayor is the biggest fair city in the world. There's a strong political will from every levels, and a lot of my colleagues in the city represents. The majority of the leaders in New York City represents communities of color and or women. We're the majority and the leadership on the team. And so that then also drives very, as what keeps me up night, a lot of the leaders within the community keeps them up night too, on how to include the whole communities that is present in New York City, and be able to thrive as a whole instead of sometimes you see New York City, it's like literally a building and just so visually, there's a penthouse as you're kind of passing by, and then we have homelessness as a problem, within the city. So you're literally, seeing it very visually as you walk through the city where those economic inequities are. And so I think that is, something that really keeps me up at night and just personally, makes me bound out of bed. Yeah. And if I may, one last thing on it is that, my 4-year-old started his first company in 1 week in New York City. So it was a lemonade stand. But I think that, on the aspect of wealth building as well, right? I mentioned, if you own your company, you have 6 times more net worth. And I think getting that wealth building message out to communities of color and immigrant communities, it's something I want to be able to get out there. I didn't know that. I want my children to know that. I want my children's friends to know it, and if I was him being able to do that in like a week in a summer camp, you're testing out like lemonade, which is a better lemonade. What flavor would sell well? How much would that be? And do that product, marketing, all of that stuff at 4-year-old. And then, at home, he sells me, he makes a little mix of drinks and he tries to sell it to me for a penny or two. And so now I have an entrepreneur at home and trying to encourage that. But even that thinking that, there's not a certain path or, you have to go this way, but that you think in an entrepreneurial way. How do you build solutions? How do you change the world? And how do you build wealth for your family and your community? And so that's also a really great thing being in New York, is just having that kind of, if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere kind of mentality, and the ecosystem is there to support that.
Great. And I'm going to ask Mayor Kawakami a question. I want you all, if you have questions, to direct them up here. If not, I'll keep talking. But Mayor Kawakami, so Loren mentioned, her 4-year-old, mixing drinks, whatever, selling drinks to her and learn how to be an entrepreneur in a week and things of that nature. If I remember right, you were a young entrepreneur, right? So you said you came from a grocery store family, but you also, I remember you telling me, it seemed like you had a newspaper route and then you were selling ice cream or something in front of schools as a teenager and those kind of things. So I mentioned that because I want to tie this question into kind of right. So one is a lot of what I heard as I've been working with you all in the community is children, right? The next generation and youth, and so that's that's part of my question to you is okay, how does that play into this idea of the work that you do? That it's not just for the kind of the adults I see, but it's this next generation, and so kind of where does that sit in your mind? Because inclusion can go across generations as well. The last part of that I want to say is so you're literally on an island, right? I mean, so it's not a figure of you're literally on an island, which means that, you're importing stuff, you're all these kind of things. But what y'all don't know about the mayor here, the mayor is a avid surfer. And so he got to catch a few waves before his day and things of that nature. And so inclusion and development is hard, right? But so is surfing, right? And surfing, you're trying to catch some wave to go somewhere. Inclusion development, you're trying to catch some wave to go somewhere. So what's harder, surfing or inclusive development?
Surfing is a lot easier. And by the way, I hope your 4-year-old son has the appropriate permits and is operating in an appropriately zoned area.
It's a very mayoral. He's going to get citation when I get home.
Government has a way of making things very hard and challenging, I tell you. And but surfing is definitely easier. I tell you, has anybody here tried surfing at all? You got to stand up, right? Yeah. I tell you, surfing, when you compare it to a sport like golf, where golf, the margin of error is so small that just a mismovement 1 inch could result in disastrous results, while surfing is designed to really be creative. And I tell you, anybody can surf, and if you don't believe me, you can Google Core Kauai, Kore, Kauai, and it's a group of retired firefighters, business people, attorneys, every walk of life, and it's designed to bring people and teach them how to surf and love surfing for a community that most people would think would never be able to surf, and that's our disabled community. And I tell you, when you talk about inclusivity, oftentimes we overlook just beyond the racial divides. And I tell you, the one great thing about surfing is, when I became mayor, I thought I was going to be able to get more waves. That's not necessarily true. Because when you're out in that ocean, all of the titles, whether you're rich or whether you're poor, it's a sport that's truly designed to incorporate everybody. And even our most famous surfer, Duke Kahanamoku, said the best surfer out there is the one having the most fun. That's basically what it is. And I tell you, what surfing requires that's similar to being inclusive is it requires people to adapt and change to an ever-evolving environment. There's no two waves that you're going to catch as a surfer that's going to be the same. And it takes an internal change. And case in point, on my long flight here from San Francisco to North Carolina, I watched a movie called The Best of Enemies. And I didn't even know what the movie was about. But it's about Durham's own Ann Atwater and C.P. Ellis. C.P. Ellis was the former leader of the KKK here in North Carolina. Ann Atwater was an outspoken civil rights freedom fighter. And the topic of desegregation in the schools was happening during that time period. And it spoke about how these two individuals on opposite ends of the spectrum had this unlikely friendship evolve based on the common denominator of what is the best thing for our children. And I tell you, it almost brings tears to my eyes because you would never be able to expect people to be able to change like that internally, where they created this lifelong bond. And that's the same thing with surfing and the same thing that needs to happen if we're truly going to be inclusive. Because the easiest thing to do is judge. We do it all the time. And so internally, we're all as individuals required to make that change and adaptation. And if you haven't surfed, I'd like to personally invite all of you to come to Kauai, especially you, Mayor, to help spur economic development. I did also bring my wife and my sophomore 15-year-old daughter that's out there somewhere in Durham, North Carolina, stimulating the economy. You know, my wife's got a black belt in shopping. So if you want to invite me to your city,
I hope they're not drinking any unlicensed lemonades.
Well, look, one good turn deserves another. When they asked me to come to, May Rose asked me to come to Kauai, right? I had it so fit in my schedule. So I go out there, and this is August, right? So I'm looking at my calendar. I'm like, okay, I'm going out to Kauai, and she said, oh, you can't just come and go back. You got to stay a few days. So I had like 5 days, and I realized I can't go to Kauai for 5 days without taking my wife, my 2 kids, and so we stimulated your economy plenty.
Thank you.
Questions for these great mayors. Erica has the microphone. We got time for a few questions. Erica has the microphone.
Hi, I'm Valerie Mosley. Thank you so much for this really exciting and stimulating conversation. Thank you, Henry, for your vision. I'm working with the city of Philadelphia on this issue of inequality and wealth issues, and we're talking a lot about entrepreneurship, but you said something that at the end of the day, the choices that individuals make matter, and often they don't get access to investing, and they don't know about, and so financial literacy, they don't have access to it. But last year, for the first time ever, Fidelity they reduced their minimums to 0. So people, your son, could invest and open an account for $10. They also have a handful of funds where the fees are absolutely 0. And most people don't know this, but nowadays you can have it. So there's the opportunity to take technology and make it available to people who in the past didn't get the type of servicing that they had. So one, I wanted to make sure that you know that, and if I can be helpful, I'd be happy to do that. The other question I wanted to ask you really is about conscious capital. So in each of your situations, you talked about the strong private sector, and I'm wondering whether or not you think that there are either foundations of these corporations that might be willing to put up money as a reserve and perhaps reward people who do great, make good decisions behaviorally, and so that you can bring, it's something like Henry has talked about, where the nonprofits might invest in bonds, and the money that comes back you can use for investing in businesses. But similarly, do you know of or have relationships with these nonprofits and or businesses that have foundations that might be able to help close that gap with individuals even away from entrepreneurship?
Any of y'all can give a quick, yeah.
I'll start with that. That's really important, and I appreciate your asking that question. I'll just talk about one way in which I think we've just done something I'm really proud of that I think can be an example for this other kind of work we've been talking about. We have just closed on a $10 million affordable housing loan fund that has a very specific purpose. It's to allow our nonprofits, or it could be for-profits, but our affordable housing developers to compete quickly in the market against private investors when affordable housing, naturally occurring affordable housing comes up for sale. Now what has to happen, in order to keep housing affordable long term, you have to have a subsidy. You can't have affordable housing without a subsidy if it's going to be permanent. And so in order to arrange that subsidy, it takes time. You have to go to the government. You have to get a low-income housing tax credit. You have to get a subsidy from the city. So our affordable housing developers haven't been able to act quickly against private developers in the market. So this loan fund allows us to pre-qualify those affordable housing developers. They're able to move quickly in the market, and they get the loan at 100% loan to value. The interest rate is 3.5%. They can hold for 5 years, and during that 5 years, they have 5 years to arrange the permanent subsidy. So it's a great tool. We just got it started already. We have applicants for it. I think it's going to be great. The reason that I'm talking about it is it's exactly what you said. The city put up the top loss. The city put up the risk capital, $2 million of risk capital, but we have 3 private partners who are the conscious capital that you talked about. Duke University put in $3 million. The North Carolina Community Development Initiative put in a couple of $1 million. And SunTrust Bank, which is just a traditional bank. They're not a particular community financial institution, but they have put up their $3 million at 2% interest. All of them have committed to 10 years of this fund. I think that's the same kind of model we have to have for the Economic Development Fund, the Debt and Equity Fund that we're going to have. We're not going to get that unless we have some conscious capital participating. And so I think that role is critically important, and I know we'll be looking for partners, and if you're interested, we'll come see you.
Doug?
Good morning, and thank you for the panel. My name is Doug Spade. I'm a serial tech entrepreneur here in Durham. Quick question. I was moved by the disempowerment documentary yesterday that highlighted the disconnect between capital creation and the deployment of that capital within communities. And I've been able to see this multiple times across emerging tech hubs across the country, both with Google for Startups as one of their entrepreneurs in residence, and also a collaborator with Steve Case and the Rise of the Rest fund. And what I've noticed is a trend after these capital channels and vehicles are created, they're largely dependent upon white privileged organizations and individuals to then execute and deploy that capital, and it creates a disconnect in the community. Can you talk about some of the ways that you are trying to close that gap between the creation of these capital vehicles and the execution and deployment of it by people outside of those communities that you're trying to benefit?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. You know, that remains to be a challenge even in Hawaii itself. One of the populations that we're trying to focus on empowerment and really moving them forward is our Native Hawaiian population. And there's a number of organizations that were designed and are quite frankly mandated to provide funding sources for entrepreneurship, for health and wellness. And it's been a challenge because they're an elected board, and because there's here's the disconnect. If you're an elected official, you got there because you won a popularity contest. That's basically what it is. When people say it's not a popularity contest, it is. And popular decisions are oftentimes not the right decisions. Like even within my household, when I have to tell my wife and daughter, like, look, this is the budget for North Carolina because we just got back from Japan. That's the right thing to do, but they're not happy with me. They're not happy. But in the same sense, we have this Office of Hawaiian Affairs that draws in revenue for any state or government entity that's on Native Hawaiian lands, ceded lands. And so they're sitting on this capital. And in fact, as part of the state of Hawaii's settlement agreement to past injustices, we gave them a prime parcel of waterfront property for them to start drawing in revenue, and they have failed to deploy any type of strategy. They have failed to get those resources out to the people that they've intended for it to be for. And I don't have an easy answer for that, except that we need to start electing people that can make those tough, unpopular decisions. And that's an extremely hard thing to do because by the nature of it, you have people holding office based on making popular decisions.
So
If I may share, so I think earlier I shared about that $30 million We Venture fund specifically for women and women of color in tech specifically. And so, I mean, I think to ensure, that really gets to the hands of the community that we wanted to get to, I think has really helped the fact that we've had our We NYC Women Entrepreneurship program for the past 4 or 5 years. And so through that program, it has really been, building, the capacity of a lot of the women in tech, but also the deep connections in every single community. That literally, I mean, when I attend our sessions, I love it. I mean, it is just really, quite a representative swath of New York City in and of itself. But that took a lot of time, a lot of building relationships, but then also being able to leverage the relationships of those community organizers and builders already there, right? Like me showing up in Astoria, in Queens, where I may not have lived there, but someone that has been working there with the women and tech entrepreneurs in that space would then, okay, well, I'll give you a benefit of that then, I'll let you in through the door. So I think leveraging a lot of those partnerships and that in the communities has really helped a lot. And that has taken a lot of time and outreach.
Let me add real quick, then I'm gonna let Mike jump in.
Sure. I wanted to add in one more thing too. What's actually in our control is the West Side hosts the one landfill on Kauai, on a small island. And so we provide a host community benefit for the Kikaha community, the community that is most impacted. So they receive some revenue based on the tipping fees, the amount of tonnage of trash. And formerly what would happen is Kikaha, that community had a committee, they would formulate some proposals, it would get to the mayor's desk and we would sign off on it. What I would like to do is remove ourselves from the equation and say, look, we want to just grant this money over to a nonprofit. We want you folks to have self-governance, create your rules, and start using that money to empower yourselves. Let's see if you can create some revenue generation. Instead of providing grants to sports teams that have to travel, why don't you take a look at purchasing a piece of property or even a business? The whole concept, if you teach a person how to fish, they eat for life.
So I'm gonna let Mike chime in, and then we'll wrap up.
Sure. And I think one of the things I spend a lot of time thinking about is how do we ensure that we're not just always listening to the usual voices, right, in the conversation. So, and that's tough, and that's particularly tough in a city that doesn't have a lot of usual voices to begin with, and so you tend to be going to the same institutions that are there. So one of the things we are doing, and this is not new, but it's very much following a philanthropic model, is creating, we passed Measure U, and that has the potential to generate a lot of resources, and so everyone wants to talk about Measure U. And one of the things I say is I don't want to talk about Measure U. I want to talk about ideas, opportunities, that are addressing our community issues, and we'll talk about city's money after. And I also want to always figure out what's the appropriate role for the city. And it's not always funder. Sometimes it's convener, matchmaker, et cetera, on things. And that I think is a pivotal role we can do. We are in the process of creating and launching a portal through which anyone in the city, whether they have an actual proposal or idea, or they just have an idea. Maybe it's not well thought out. It's a great idea addressing something that we need to address in our community, but it hasn't been thought out. But this at least allows us to create a connectivity to them to work on it. And one of the things we are stressing is that everything needs to come through the same door. So that we in fact are looking at everything equally with respect to it. And it's our task as staff within the city of knowing how to triage. How do we look at different things? How do we look at the best opportunity, even if it's not the best project, as an example, or the most developed? That's something we're undertaking. We're hoping to get some success with that, and we're hoping to get that out the door in the next kind of couple of weeks, actually.
That's fantastic. And so, sorry I didn't get everybody a question. I was yapping up here, but you know these folks are gonna be around, so you can grab them up. But I did want to mention a couple things. So one of the things with Sacramento, you all have pulled together. You know, you have a community group that is at the table as a part of the voices of how to measure your dollars may be invested in different ideas, as you say, to generate them. And they're a very passionate group. I got a chance to meet them, and they would tell you what's on their mind. And so, yeah, they will. I'd like to also mention Durham. So our distinguished budget director here, Bertha Johnson, has been leading this participatory budgeting process, which also has sought to get voices into the equation. So there's different innovations, things like that. So I certainly want to take an opportunity to thank Mike Jasso, the Assistant City Manager of Sacramento, for coming out here, Mayor Steve Schewel for being our host mayor and coming out this morning, Loren Nadres, who is doing this great work in international trade, economic development with New York City, the one that gets the prize for the farthest travel, Mayor Derek Kawakami. And it sounds like to me, based on your comments, that that he may literally get voted off the island when he sees his wife and daughter later. So he may still be in office, but may have some household risk for his future. But help me thank them all for being a part of this.